SpaceX gears up for its first private spacewalk mission, a bunch of rocket hardware goes boom, other more fortunate rocket hardware gets ready for launch, and we just got some amazing pictures of the moon and Earth from ESA's Juice spacecraft. As always, we'll cover all that and a whole lot more this week in Spaceflight. In the space industry, tests don't always go the way you want. But you've probably also heard the saying, "This is why we test." This week, a report from Bloomberg revealed that Blue Origin had at least one incident with a New Glenn second stage during testing, and then another with a separate second stage during transport operations. According to this report, the second stage incident during transport operations resulted in the second stage crumpling, while the other second stage incident resulted in it exploding while undergoing testing. This latter incident took place inside of the company's second stage cleaning and testing facility at the Kennedy Space Center. NSF's Julia Bergeron drove by earlier this week and took this picture of the building, which in principle looks fine, until you notice there's no door, which was there before, and the panel that covered it at the top is also gone. This building is, well, it says it in the name. It's where New Glenn's second stages are cleaned and proof tested before heading out to the pad for further testing and launch. These two separate incidents came as the company is gearing up for the debut of its New Glenn rocket. While none of this hardware will be involved in that mission, it's very likely that Blue will try to make sure that none of these issues arise on that hardware while preparations are ongoing. This first flight will carry NASA's Escapade twin spacecraft to Mars, and in turn to much better news, these two spacecraft have now arrived at the Cape. While these are NASA spacecraft, they were built by Rocket Lab, and that company has been the one in charge of arranging transport of both to the Space Coast. Over the coming weeks, Rocket Lab engineers will be completing pre-launch testing, fueling the spacecraft, and integrating them with New Glenn's payload adapter and fairings before rollout to the launch site. In other better news for Blue Origin, the company recently announced that it completed more testing of its BE-7 engine set to be used on Blue's Mark I and Mark II lunar landers. The company recently filed communications permits indicating that it may launch the first Mark I Pathfinder lander no earlier than March of next year. So it's very likely we'll hear a lot more news about it really soon. This week we had a bunch of spaceflight news from Europe, some bad, some good. Unfortunately, it was not just Blue Origin who lost rocket hardware on the stand in recent days. Earlier this week, rocket factory Augsburg lost the first stage for the first flight of its RFA-1 rocket after a spectacular anomaly during testing at its launch site in Saxavord, Scotland. The anomaly took place just as the booster was undergoing a 9-engine static fire test, one of the many tests that RFA was undergoing to prepare for the rocket's first flight. According to Dr. Stefan Brieschink, RFA's chief operating officer, quote, "The root cause at this very preliminary stage seems to have been an oxygen fire in one of the turbopumps. That engine and that turbopump have run before without issues. 8 engines ignited. We had multiple backup and safety systems in place that were supposed to shut everything down, but things did not align on Monday as planned." Now the question is, when RFA will be able to close out this investigation and get back on the stand to launch this first mission. In the aftermath of the explosion, our friend Harry Stranger used his eyes in the sky to take a look at how the pad fared. From what can be seen in the satellite imagery, it looks like the damage was restricted to just the launch mount itself, and the rest of the launch site is still in great shape. Another company that's been gearing up for a launch from European soil has been Isar Aerospace. The company aims to launch its Spectrum rocket from the Andøya spaceport in Norway. This week, the spaceport received its launch site operator license from the Norwegian Ministry of Trade, Industry and Fisheries. This is one of the many steps needed for Isar and other launch companies to be able to launch from this location, one of the northernmost launch sites in the world. Now, both Isar and RFA are German launch companies, the origin of our next European spaceflight news story. This week, the European Space Agency announced that it has shipped the European service module for the Artemis 3 mission out to Kennedy Space Center. The module is currently loaded inside the agency's Canopé boat, which is already en route to the Space Coast, having departed the Airbus production facilities in Bremen, Germany. According to the ship's tracking data, it's scheduled to arrive at Port Canaveral just a week and a half from now, on September 2nd. Once at KSC, the module will be stored and prepared for the Artemis 3 mission, the first mission set to return humans back to the surface of the moon. That storage will likely last a few years, though, as this mission is currently scheduled for no earlier than September of 2026, and it's very likely to delay beyond that. A launch that will happen in a lot closer time, though, is the launch of the last Vega rocket, set to take place in early September. Preparations are already well underway for this swan song flight, which will see the launch of ESA's Sentinel-2C spacecraft into a sun-synchronous orbit. All 4 stages of Vega have been stacked together for one last time. ESA has also completed all pre-launch testing and fueling of the Sentinel-2C spacecraft, and it has also been mated to the rocket's payload adapter. Up next will be the encapsulation of the satellite in the rocket's payload fairing and installation atop Vega's 4th stage. While this will be the last launch of Vega, its successor, Vega C, is set to return to flight later this year, launching another Sentinel satellite, the Sentinel-1C, currently set to launch no earlier than mid-November. SpaceX is just days away from one of its riskiest, boldest, and most promising missions so far, Polaris Dawn. This mission is set to hit a series of milestones and prove out technologies that will be key for the company's future human exploration ambitions. Polaris Dawn will be crewed by Commander Jared Isaacman, pilot Scott Poteet, mission specialist Sarah Gillis, and medical officer Anna Menon. This week, the crew and Bill Gerstenmaier, SpaceX's Vice President of Build and Flight Reliability, held a press conference overviewing the mission and giving some details that we hadn't known previously. The 4 crew members will be riding on board Crew Dragon Resilience, launched atop a Falcon 9 rocket. The mission's first milestone will be to break the record for highest altitude reached while in orbit around the Earth, a record set during the Gemini program in the 1960s. After liftoff from Launch Complex 39A, the Falcon 9 rocket will drop off Resilience into a 190 by 1200 kilometer orbit at a 51.6 degree inclination. From there, Resilience will separate from Falcon 9 and maneuver into a 190 by 1400 kilometer orbit, breaking Gemini's altitude record. In this orbit, the spacecraft will be entering the high radiation environment of the inner Van Allen belt as it passes by its highest point. This will test Dragon's resilience against high radiation environments, and the crew will also perform tests and gather data during this first day of the mission. On the second day of the mission, the spacecraft will maneuver itself into an orbit with a lower apogee, ending up on a 190 by 700 kilometer orbit. This will set the stage for the other big milestone and goal of this mission, which is to complete the first ever private spacewalk in orbit, and also SpaceX's first spacewalk. In order to carry out the spacewalk, SpaceX teams had to develop a new spacesuit, create new procedures, modify the Crew Dragon spacecraft, and do a whole lot of other stuff in the span of about 2.5 years since this mission was first announced. SpaceX's new extravehicular activity suit introduces a great deal of advancements and improvements compared to the existing SpaceX suit in order to make it suitable for its use during a spacewalk. Apart from having joints with extra mobility and materials with better thermal properties, the spacesuit also has an integrated camera and heads-up display in its helmet. Now, a lot of this was featured in more detail on a previous episode when it was first unveiled, but it's still worth pointing out. During this week's press conference, Gerstenmaier also explained that while developing the suit, they found a potential flammability risk, which, thankfully, they have eliminated from the suit design, making it safer for future crews.
When we're in the vacuum with 100% oxygen into the spacesuits, we want to eliminate as many flammability risks as possible. It turns out we discovered that in the dry environment there can be static electric discharge, and that could potentially lead to a flammability concern. The teams went in to mitigate that. They've changed procedures, they've changed processes, they've added conductive material, and we are truly ready to go fly. This is an example of one of the many things that we learned on this flight that really haven't been exposed before in EVA suit development. So SpaceX and the teams and the crew, with their help, are continuing to push the envelope of what it takes to go to the moon and Mars.
But the suit wasn't the only thing that needed a lot of work to prepare for this mission. Crew Dragon Resilience was also upgraded with extra nitrogen and oxygen tanks. These enhance the capability of the life support system to replenish the atmosphere after the spacewalk takes place. Since Crew Dragon does not have an airlock, it'll have to be completely vented to vacuum during the spacewalk. This meant that SpaceX had to undergo a lot of testing to make sure that none of this would cause any issues like outgassing that could impact the crew and the mission. Resilience was also fitted with mobility aids inside of the capsule, and the hatch has been fitted with Skywalker, a mobility aid for the spacewalking astronauts to safely maneuver out of the capsule. But it wasn't just hardware needing changes either. A lot of procedures had to be created, and others had to be modified. In order to avoid decompression sickness, the spacecraft's atmosphere will slowly be brought down to a nearly pure oxygen environment at low pressure over the first 45 hours after orbital insertion. This will be followed on the third day of the mission with a short pre-breathing session at 100% oxygen inside the EVA suit that will fully remove the nitrogen from the crew's bodies. The crew has been training for all of this for the last 2 years, providing feedback to the SpaceX teams and improving processes every step of the way.
You know, what's special about this mission is that we have 2 SpaceX employees on the Polaris Dawn crew, Sarah and Anna. Each have individually contributed to the development of the SpaceX human spaceflight program, especially the Dragon capsule, and provided invaluable experience of training and supporting crews have really contributed in a big way to this mission.
The whole spacewalk procedure is set to take about 2 hours from the start of depressurization to the repressurization sequence. Sarah Gillis and Jared Isaacman will be the 2 crew members set to exit resilience during this period of time, although only one at a time. Before, during, and after the spacewalk, the crew will also be involved in about 40 science experiments. There will also be a demonstration of Starlink's laser communication technology after the spacewalk takes place. SpaceX has installed a Plaser on Dragon's trunk, which is the company's name for its plug-and laser system. This system allows spacecraft other than Starlink satellites to be able to use the inter-satellite laser links, and in this case, Dragon will use it to connect to the Starlink constellation, a first for the company. While Starlink users on the ground use a more traditional phased array antenna system to connect to Starlink, connecting through its laser links while in space could bring bandwidth substantially larger than traditional Ku-band and Ka-band communications. This is just one of the many ways that this mission is helping to pave the way for future SpaceX missions.
Just to add one thing, one of the things I'm most excited about from this development effort is all of the learnings that are going to go back into Dragon operation. New software features, how the suits are constructed. There is learning across every single team, materials, engineering, you name it. There has been development and there has been lessons learned.
And now let's take a quick glimpse at some other stories across space. Firefly Aerospace is making great progress on 2 major programs for the company. Just last week, Firefly confirmed it completed qualification, acceptance testing, and installation of the 8 Spectre thrusters on its first Blue Ghost lunar lander. These will serve as the spacecraft's reaction control system when on its way to the moon and while attempting to land on the lunar surface. Additionally, Firefly also announced this week that it's completed the first test tank for its upcoming medium launch vehicle. This test tank is a scaled-down version of the first stage tanks, with the same diameter but shorter length than the booster tanks, that will be used to gather data on the quality of the build for this large composite structure. This tank is now installed at the company's test stand at Briggs, Texas, and will undergo testing there over the next few weeks and months. After that, Firefly plans to follow this up with a full first stage tank structure that will also be tested, slowly checking off all of the milestones on its way towards the first launch of its medium launch vehicle rocket. NASA astronauts Sunita Williams and Butch Wilmore have been on the International Space Station for over 75 days now, about 10 times longer than originally planned. If you've been around for a while, you probably know that both went up to the ISS on Boeing's Starliner spacecraft called Calypso. However, problems with this spacecraft service module have kept NASA and Boeing teams down on the ground busy, trying to figure out a way to return them both home safely. All of this involved several tests, both on the ground and in orbit, to verify service module behavior. It also involved considering returning both astronauts on SpaceX's Crew Dragon spacecraft, with contingency procedures set in place if that happens. Well, after many weeks of testing and data reviews, NASA has set a date for when it'll finally decide what ride home Sunny and Butch will take. This Saturday, August 24th, the agency's leadership, including Administrator Bill Nelson, will meet as part of an internal agency test flight readiness review where the final call will be made. The agency will follow this up with a media conference where many more details will be shared, so you can bet that we'll have a lot to talk about in next week's episode. Now let's take a look at all the space traffic this week and see what's coming up next week in spaceflight. Starting off the week on August 16th, an SSLV lifted off from the Satish Dhawan Space Center in India, carrying 2 satellites into low Earth orbit. The main payload on this mission was a satellite called EOS-08, developed by the Indian Space Research Organization, or ISRO, to test new technologies for small Earth observation satellites. EOS-08 sports an infrared telescope for, among other things, disaster monitoring, observation of volcanic activity, and satellite-based surveillance. It also hosts an instrument that studies weather using the Global Navigation Satellite System and a UV radiation dosimeter that's being tested for ISRO's Gaganyaan crew spacecraft. The second payload on this flight was a demonstration satellite for Space Rickshaw to test the company's satellite bus and deployment system. This was the SSLV's third launch and the final launch of the rocket's development program. With this successful flight, ISRO's new small satellite launcher is now ready for operational missions. A few hours later, we had a Changzheng 4B launch from the Xichang Satellite Launch Center in China. The rocket lifted off on August 16th at 7:35 UTC, carrying a few military remote sensing satellites. These satellites are outfitted with technology experiments for low Earth orbit constellations, but not much more is known about them due to the classified nature of the payload. Tracking data later revealed that the rocket had placed 9 satellites into low Earth orbit. The 16th was a busy day for spaceflight around the world, as a Falcon 9 also lifted off from California at 1856 Universal Time that same day. On board were a massive 116 payloads for the Transporter 11 rideshare mission. It was certainly a busy ride into sun-synchronous orbit. The payloads on this launch came from all over the world and include satellites from NASA, the European Space Agency, and at least 18 different countries. Notably, the mission carried Senegal's first satellite. The booster for this mission, B-1075, successfully ended its 12th flight by touching down on SpaceX's Landing Zone 4 at Vandenberg. On August 17th, the crew on board the International Space Station took a delivery of 2,621 kilograms of cargo. The Progress MS-28 spacecraft arrived at the station after a 2-day journey. At 5:53 UTC, Progress performed its automated docking to the aft port of the station's Zvezda module, where it will stay for the next 6 months. The cosmonauts at the ISS have already started unpacking the food and supplies on board. Later in the week, the European Space Agency's Jupiter Icy Moons Explorer, or JUICE, flew by Earth and the Moon and sent back some amazing pictures. The spacecraft was launched on its way to Jupiter in April of last year, but it first needs to get on the right trajectory to get there. To do that, ESA designed the mission to include so-called gravity assists. During these carefully planned maneuvers, the spacecraft flies close by a planet or another celestial body. If done correctly, the planet's gravity accelerates the spacecraft and changes its trajectory. Or, in other words, the maneuver speeds up the spacecraft by slowing the planet down ever so slightly. JUICE made a particularly complicated approach using a double flyby, getting a gravity assist from both the Moon and Earth. ESA claims this is the first time a double gravity assist has ever been executed. On August 19th at 21:16 Universal Time, JUICE cruised by the Moon at roughly 700 kilometers from the lunar surface. This flyby sent JUICE on a path towards Earth, where it performed its closest approach a little over 24 hours later on August 20th at 21:57 UTC. It flew only 6,840 kilometers above Southeast Asia and the Pacific Ocean. Mission scientists took this occasion to test the spacecraft's cameras and scientific instruments to get to know their behavior a bit better ahead of its arrival to Jupiter. However, JUICE won't get there anytime soon. This flyby sent the spacecraft towards Venus for another gravity assist, which will take place next year. JUICE will then perform 2 more Earth flybys in 2026 and 2029. These will then get the spacecraft into its trajectory towards Jupiter, where it will finally arrive in 2031. While these gravity assists are not the fastest way to reach a destination, they do save a lot of propellant and are thus used for many science missions far from Earth. ESA estimates that this flyby saved the mission 100 to 150 kilograms of fuel. So we may have to be patient, but it'll sure be worth the wait. We also had another Starlink launch this week. On August 20th, a Falcon 9 took to the Floridian skies to launch 22 Starlink V2 mini satellites. Liftoff took place at 13:20 UTC from Space Launch Complex 40. This mission was flown on a brand new booster, B-1085, which landed successfully on SpaceX's drone ship, a shortfall of Gravitas. With 1 flight under its belt, it'll return to Port Canaveral ahead of its next flight, the much-discussed Crew 9 mission in late September. This mission was originally supposed to be the booster's first flight, but with the delay caused by the Starliner situation, it got a chance to gain a little bit of experience first. With this launch, SpaceX has launched a total of 7,917 satellites, of which 570 have re-entered and 5,738 have moved into their operational orbit. On August 22nd, another launch took place from China. This time, a Changzheng 7A lifted off at 12:25 UTC from the Wenchang Space Launch Site. The payload was the ChinaSat 4A communication satellite, which will provide voice, data, radio, and television service. Going into next week, on August 27th, we'll have the long-awaited Polaris Dawn mission. Falcon 9 is set to lift off from the historic Launch Complex 39A at the Kennedy Space Center, with the 4.5-hour launch window opening at 7:38 Universal Time. The crew of 4 will spend 5 days on board Crew Dragon Resilience, performing various tests and experiments. The next day, Falcon 9 is expected to launch another batch of Starlink V2 Mini and direct-to-cell satellites into low Earth orbit. This mission is set to lift off from Space Launch Complex 40 in Florida. The 4.5-hour window for this launch opens on August 28th at 5:50 UTC. And wrapping up the week, on August 29th, another Falcon 9 is set to launch from Vandenberg, carrying a payload for the U.S. National Reconnaissance Office. This is expected to be the third launch for the NRO's proliferated space architecture, also known as Starshield. The launch window for this mission has not yet been announced. And that's your weekly update of spaceflight news. I'm Elysia Segal for NSF, and I'll see you all again next week to recap this week in spaceflight.